Great, thanks. And I want to say the great talk, Michelle. I cannot agree more about the design principle of the overture and also for the BioThings. So when we find the things you do more, when you find the things you do like repeatedly, repetitively, that's the time to build a new API, a new web service that you can reuse, and not to help yourself, but also help the other team. Okay, today I'm going to talk about the BioThings SDK project and how we use it to build the knowledge-based API and how can we use it for the knowledge integration in the biomedical research. Great, so let me, great. So nowadays, I think for this BOSC audience, and we all pretty much familiar with API, especially when we talk about API, and I'm talking about web service API specifically, because we use it as a tool to share the data, share the knowledge. So nowadays, we can see the increasing usage of the API in the biomedical field. And a lot of data provider, knowledge provider now not only providing the flat file, but also providing the API. For example, the Open Target project in the day one of the BOSC, right? You have the data, and you also provided the GraphQL API, which is great. And now we see this good trend, and not necessarily replacing the flat file, but those two API and the flat file can be used together, provide more flexible access of all the underlying data, underlying knowledge, so that we have a better file sharing data. So to this audience, I think the BioThings project has been presented to multiple times in the past for the BOSC. So you're probably familiar with or even using the BioThings API we provide. And for example, this mygene.info focuses on the gene annotations, and we also providing the myvariant info. Mychem.info focuses on chemical and the drugs. We also have the mydisease, is a disease and the phenotype. And recently we built the myGeneSet, focus on the functional gene set pathway. And we also have another smaller one, is a taxonomy species, which is just an easy to use API for you to build your own bioinformatics pipeline and or build your own web applications. So, but this is not the focus of this talk. We want to bring you new things from another angle from the BioThings project, which is called like a BioThings SDK. It's focused on not that we provided the API for you to use and so that you don't have to build, but it's really a tool to help you to build an additional knowledge API. And that's why we call the BioThings SDK. And here I want to focus on two specific use cases. A, for your particular team, you might have a data, you might build a wonderful knowledge source. You want to make it not just a file dump, but also providing the API to share your knowledge. And how can I do that, right? And second use case, maybe a more like a larger project or collaborative project involve multiple teams. And if you are the informatics lead, you want to build an integrated knowledge platform for your project. And ideally, this is not just an effort done by one person or one team. Hopefully, distribute the work to the multiple team within your large project, right? So how can we do that, and how the BioThings SDK can help with these two scenarios? Now, if you look at this chart, I think that's how we think of the kind of a life cycle of building a more sustainable web service API focused on knowledge sharing. And nowadays, I think with a little bit of like software engineering background, you're probably very easy to build an API. And on your laptop, that's relatively easy. You download a file, write a parser, index it in some database, and then you write a simple API, a web query API interface. That's quick, simple. But when you think about it, you want to build a production ready or sustainable knowledge API. Actually, there's still a lot of work to involve here, right? You need to, for example, the data source might change, and so you need to update, continue update. And then if you build an initial version of API and then the underlying packaging might change, you still need to keep everything update. And now if you wanted and meet like the actual usage or increase the usage, you want to deploy to some like a more sustainable, more robust server infrastructure, so maybe it will run more stably. You want to deal with like a maybe no downtime deployment, or how can you do that? If you have more user to use, and now you need to think about how to scale up, how to, and more important, how to distribute work when your project grow bigger and bigger to multiple teams, right? How to scale up your application, also how to scale up your development team. So that's what the BioThings API can, BioThings SDK can help. So this is how we can get it started, right? So if you want to build your own API for the scenario 1, you start with something called data plugin, and that is basically very simple. You firstly just write you download your file, you write a parser, and that parser will generate some kind of the JSON output. And typically, when we talk about a BioThings API, one API focuses on one particular so-called like a BioThings type, a gene, a drug, and then you attach the attribute to this object. But if you have multiple entities and you're talking about association, that association itself can be an object too, right? Just like this example. This is talk about the gene to phenotype association, right? So that itself is the object. So that's your parser. And now you need to create a manifest file that adding some metadata about your data source, and particularly like there's a data URL, how to, so that will enable us to help you to check the data source and do a scheduled downloading when there's a new version is available, right? And then you point to the parser you just have in the upload session. So that's it. And we also recognize that there's some data source might need to involve like a more complex workflow. In that case, you can just using the Docker abstract all the complex workflow, not necessarily in Python because SDK is writing in Python, but you can write it in Java, in R for your complex workflow. And so you still can use this data plugin architecture. You specify not just the HTTP URL, now you have a Docker Docker version of the UI, right? Launch a container, run something, and then get something out. Right, that's it. And once you have a data plugin, we provide a command line tool called BioThings SALI. Is a very new feature we just released. So you can run your data plugin you just created in your repo, and you can test in downloading the data. That's a num step, and you can run the parser. That's uploading step, and all of this is no dependency. You don't need to set up any database locally. You just run the parser and upload data to a local SQLite. That's just easy. And everything you need is just locally install the Python, like BioThings package with this bracket CLI in it. Right. So then once that is done, and you can inspect your data, check your data, follow if your output follows the best practice. And then you can even run the simple API server locally. You can test your data, verify everything looks good, right, before you move to the next level. So now, once you are satisfied with the data plugin, and then you can use the full stack like a BioThings SDK to handle all the actual deployment, and maybe if you want to get like a more flexible query feature, you do need to index it in a more sophisticated database. Here is you can do some JSON object merging in the MongoDB, then maybe indexed in Elasticsearch, and then build an API on top of that. That's how the kind of the actual BioThings production API works. And now we even provide a BioThings Studio as a web UI on top of this underlying BioThings SDK. So manage all the multiple data plugins. You can merge them and build multiple APIs, build it like and each data plugin will check the data source, do the data merging. You can do the deployment, manage your data release to the AWS or to your local server, and that can be done in this web interface. And that's exactly how BioThings project works in this as called like a NCAS translator project, right? Because NCAS translator project focusing on the data integration and across all those, a lot of long list of the so-called like a BioThings type, right? All of this list is not very complete. So BioThings project fits right in. We're not just providing the core API, but we also host over 50 knowledge APIs for translator hosted in this website, and we call like a knowledge provider APIs. So now we build so many APIs, and not just we created those APIs. We use the BioThings SDK actually help the other translator team so that they can build their own like a data plugin I just mentioned, and then we help them to deploy, host the knowledge API. And now we have so many APIs within the translator team. So then we build another tool called Smart API as an API registry, and that manages all the like kind of an API lifecycle. For example, testing like uptime, make sure everything's good, and also providing the live API documentation. It's based on open API standard. So, and it's also even built like the translator specific API portal, so that one project and you can manage all the knowledge API within one portal within the Smart API registry. Right? And here about the Smart API is not just this API registry, you also understand semantics of the biomedical knowledge APIs, right? It tells you, it actually understands how API works by accepting what parameter in and what output, what response out. And so, and by doing that, annotating all those APIs in the Smart API registry, we have this metadata called metakg knowledge. So that's kind of a subway map connecting between the multiple BioThings project, and that will connect each other between those knowledge, those entity type with the line represented each API. Right? So you will hear a lot more exciting feature from the Jackson's talk this afternoon, and about the BioThings Explorer, which takes the Smart API metadata and will do all this knowledge integration and cross API knowledge queries to answer the more complex biomedical questions. So, and I will finish here, and thanks to all the teams who work behind the BioThings project and the Translator project. Thank you.